Hey, everybody, welcome to the Daily Objective. And I have been called upon to host solo today. It's been a while since I did one of these, so I can use your help in the chat, in the super chat. And please leave a like on the video and subscribe if you're not. All right, so by now you may have heard that the objectivist fossil fuels advocate Alex Epstein was smeared by the Washington Post a week or two ago, in which an essay I think he wrote when he was about 18 or 19 was strongly implied to be racist by the Washington Post. And from what I understand, the essay was saying something that is often said and should often be said by advocates of capitalism and liberty, which is saying, like, look how much better life is in the Western world compared to less free, less rational cultures. Now, those are like fighting words in many circles, but I think it ought to be said, and it ought to be said with clarity. And the person saying it should know what he means in saying it, right? So, I mean, it's easy. It's just as easy as saying, look at North versus South Korea, right? Look at East versus West Germany, right? Or just look at the Western world in general versus the developing world or the not yet developing world. So I think in Epstein's essay, he compared the Western world to Chad, which I think is in Africa, which imagine the tourism opportunities of a country called Chad. If only they had capitalism, liberty, and for that, they need a philosophical revolution, or they need the introduction of philosophy in general. They need less mysticism, and they need Aristotle and the Greek influence, just like the Western world has, luckily. But there's nothing racist about making that comparison. There's nothing saying that, Chad is inherently populated by, worse people or less capable people. And in fact, if you do look at statistics, it's my understanding that African immigrants to the US are among the highest, if not the highest performing group of immigrants in terms of education, low crime, et cetera. So there's nothing racist about making the comparison of, the Western world versus, let's say, Africa. It really, but that needs to be clarified. And a lot of people still take it as inherently offensive, which raises the issue that I think in most philosophical views, that is outside of Ayn Rand's philosophy, I think if you sort of survey what most intellectuals believe in the modern world, they sort of explain the difference between the Western world and Africa. They explain it as either genetic. I mean, they don't want to say it out loud, a lot of them, but you kind of push them hard enough, they've got like a genetic explanation for differing performances among groups or different countries or different, regions, different continents. Either they're genetic, or on the more, like, I guess, leftist, postmodernist, whatever it is, social justice perspective, the difference in performance between different groups or different countries is that the system itself is designed to benefit one group over another. So if you think about what this means, the people who are alleging racism at a statement like that, so the people who they say, look how much better the West is performing, how much better life is in the West as opposed to Chad. People who hear that and they allege that that's racist, I think many of them, they hold themselves that racism benefits the Western world. They think the West actually is desirable for the race that is performing better. They explain all differences in performance. They attribute it to race. Or on the flip side, the more hushed perspective you get from kind of the, biological determinists, more of these evolutionary pseudoscientists, many of them, I think to a large degree, they think that the difference is genetic at the end of the day, right? So even though a lot of these people, many people in the world today do consider free will to be somewhat of a thing, Ayn Rand is not the only philosopher that believes in free will, but she may be the only one who really, really embraces the belief in free will, or the observance of free will, maybe is a better way to put it. It does seem that even when mainstream intellectuals believe there's some place for free will, like you could sort of attribute some of human action to free will and the influence of ideas and philosophy. But at the end of the day, you really need to find a better explanation for differences in cultures, differences in performance by groups of people. So again, you have the sort of leftist perspective that any difference in performance between countries or between groups of people in the US, for instance, must be that the system itself is designed to benefit whites over blacks or whatever, straights over gays, etc. And of course, it doesn't even make sense because, like I said, many high performing groups, let's say Nigerians, let's say gays, they often far surpass their straight white counterparts in the culture. And of course, and again, like I said, the many of the sort of reactionaries, the sort of or conservative people, the people who reject the leftist postmodernist perspective, many of them, they don't want to say it this way, but they see genetics as being the determining factor in differences in performances among groups anytime that one group is performing better than another, or oftentimes. And the way I interpret this, when I see them explaining differences with these reasons, that they think it's that the system itself is designed to hold blacks down or hold Africans down, or they think that the difference is genetic, it's like they're actually harboring racist views of people. They actually think either that race is important, like that genetics determine your destiny, or they actually think that racism benefits a group of people. They actually think that racism is desirable. And we see this this sort of approach everywhere. I mean, I'm reminded of Leonard Peikoff's book on objectivism. I think it was in the chapter on government or on politics where I'm obviously paraphrasing from memory, Peikoff points out that most people seem to think dictatorship is desirable. Like if you're the dictator, you've won. And that's what made America so kind of afraid of the Soviet Union more than was necessary. That's, again, me paraphrasing from memory and maybe adding my little spin to it. But once you realize that irrationality and force are not desirable, once you realize that reason, that respecting individual rights, that capitalism and the practical is the moral, is what's desirable, then you're sort of freed of this ghost that you're sort of living with. And I do see a lot of sort of mainstream intellectuals as sort of living with this ghost. I mean, what's a metaphor? Like the bill collector is coming at some point, like you're tossing and turning, waiting for the reaper to show up, whatever the metaphor is that I'm fishing for. Like they hold a premise. They hold either that racism benefits them or benefits someone, like that the system the same system that enables the individual to live rationally, like the same system, capitalism, that enables the individual to pursue his own values, that same system also elevates one race over the other and is inherently oppressive and racist. The enemy of the practical is the moral, the way that they see it, and no such dichotomy actually exists. So the title of this episode is Living on Borrowed Time, which is a remark that a guy named Chris Williamson once made to me. He's a friend of mine here in Austin. He's on YouTube. He does for all of your culture, fitness, dating, and lifestyle concerns. You can subscribe to him. But I saw him at a party, and he said in a friendly tone, "You are living on borrowed time." Kind of like you're getting away with, and that got me thinking, like, well, aren't we all living on borrowed time? And I don't just mean this in like the deep, poetic, we're all going to die for whom the bell tolls sense. But how many times a day do you break a social justice law? Like it's been said that like everyone breaks 7 laws a day, like in terms of actual laws on the books that you don't even know about, laws that have been on the books from antiquity that you don't even know you're breaking. But when it comes to social justice, in terms of things that could get you canceled, I mean, everything you do virtually can be traced back to white supremacy. I mean, you see at the you see at some of these lectures that are emerging that, you know, social justice feminists or social justice intersectional theorists are delivering, the word objectivity is being considered white supremacist. Objectivity, individualism. So basically things that life requires, things that are both practical as well as in your interest, obviously by virtue of being practical, everything that life requires and is desirable, ultimately in some way contributes to this system that is, you know, said to be white supremacist because, you know, it is, they think it demonstrably raises one race of people over another. Now, their statistics are often junk. They don't want to believe that, you know, that non-whites are able to succeed in the modern world. But that's not even the main issue. As you can see, the main issue that I am pointing to is that to them, the actual requirements of reality, objectivity, capitalism, property rights, individual rights in general, are to them white supremacist. Or, like I said, the sort of reactionaries to that whole thing often, if you push them hard enough, they'll sort of say, like, genetics are kind of what account for the differences in different groups of people or in different countries. So these people are living with racist premises one way or the other. Either one of them believes that the races are, there actually is such a thing as race and that it determines how your life is going to end up. And the other group of them actually believes that the requirements for living result in racism. So they are living on borrowed time, so to speak. So we are all living on borrowed time in terms of that we're all going to get canceled sooner or later, unless we really lay low. Every one of us is doing something that's offensive to the woke. There's that respect in which we're all living on borrowed time. And then the cancelers, the people who are pointing the finger, are themselves living on borrowed time in terms of the fact that they live with these premises. They actually, in their heart of hearts, so to speak, in their subconscious, at least, if not their conscious convictions, they actually think that reality is racist. That's no way to live, is it? Now, there's another aspect to so-called cancel culture that I've been thinking about, which is the dynamic of the young versus the old. So young people rolling their eyes at their parents is an ongoing thing, right? I don't know if it's inherent. Like, I don't know if it's something that you would see humans doing in any culture with any philosophy. I've wondered about this, but it is something we definitely see in this world of ours, in the modern world, right? With every passing generation, what was hip to one generation, their kids tend to roll their eyes at and sort of think is stupid. And I wonder how much of that overlaps with this sort of zealous vandalizing of statues, right? Like pulling down statues of past heroes or just past historical figures, pulling down these statues like we've seen in recent years, certainly, and probably earlier as well. But this canceling of historical figures, I wonder how much of it is sort of motivated by this youthful restlessness that doesn't have much of a guide, doesn't have much of a philosophical guide in that helps them separate sort of kind of properly rolling your eyes at something that was only really relevant when your parents were growing up. Let's say your parents like a certain type of music. You had to be a certain age. You had to be living in a certain culture maybe to really, really love that music, to fall in love with that music the way your parents did. And you're just sort of over it. You're not into it. And so kind of separating that from actual there is a proper way to evaluate the past, right? So we can evaluate Thomas Jefferson in a way that is, I think, largely positive. You know, maybe if he were alive today, we'd want him condemned for, let's say, his owning of slaves and treatment of them, and other crimes he may have committed. But as a historical figure, we can just see him for what makes him stand out in history. Owning slaves does not make him stand out in history. Writing the Declaration of Independence, of course, is what makes Jefferson stand out. And we can love him and revere him and have his statue protected and have his statue out in the street for that historical significance of Jefferson. So as I'm trying to articulate here, there is sort of a proper way to evaluate the past, and without a good philosophy in the culture, without good guidance, it seems that the young, they don't really know how to separate like proper kind of rejection of maybe what your parents were into or what your grandparents did that should properly be rejected. Like, okay, let's say your grandparents were actually racist. Okay, let's say your grandparents actually were racist, and there's no silver lining, there's no excuse. They were just racist because they were racist. You can reject that, you can condemn that, but that is not the same. Like there is a version of there's a proper way to look at your grandparents and to recognize, I don't mean just your personal grandparents, but the older generations, and see what good things they were able to do in their own context. Maybe they made new strides towards liberty, towards reason, right? Towards the discovery of a good philosophy. So there is a rock group that I discovered as a teenager that were, I think they were medium-sized level of popularity. They're called Mindless, Self-Indulgence, which if you're a real Atlas Shrugged aficionado, you know that phrase was in the John Galt speech, where I think Galt was saying something like, being selfish is not mindless self-indulgence, but being, properly selfish is rational, pursuing rational values, long-term, looking at your life as a whole. Again, paraphrasing here, but again, Galt was saying being selfish is not mindless self-indulgence. And this group named themselves Mindless Self-Indulgence. They were, if you're into, rock music, if you're into kind of modern industrial electronic rock, you might know them, you might like some of them. They were very much, they were like very relevant in the 2000s, I think. That was like kind of where they shined. And I'm reminded of them both in terms of like so-called cancel culture and how like everyone's sort of living on borrowed time. They had a song called Bring the Pain that I remember looking up the lyrics, and I just couldn't believe that a group with any sort of mainstream presence could say these lyrics. Like they were not just mildly racist, like they were like not only saying the N-word, but they were saying things that I never thought I would hear outside of like the Jim Crow South, outside of like To Kill a Mockingbird. And then I found out, oh, it's actually a cover. They're covering a rap song by a couple guys from the group, the Wu-Tang Clan. So these lyrics were actually originally delivered by a couple of African-American rappers, I think addressed to other African-Americans. So it's more thought-provoking and sort of ironic, I think, than it is, hateful or anything like that. So that's the type of thing that the group Mindless Self-Indulgence would do. They would take a song with such shocking lyrics and they would deliver the song, they would cover it in their own way. And now, of course, they're still very cancelable for that, right? Of course, the view today is if you're white or you look white, there is no context in which you can say the N-word or say anything racist, even with quotation marks, even in context. In another reason that this group comes to mind to me with recent news is, so they had a song called "I Hate Jimmy Page," which kind of spoke to a lot of people like me, like growing up in like the 90s, the 2000s, there was all this like, anytime you turn on VH1 or the Grammys or any sort of establishment media, there's all this like, oh, you'd better respect the Rolling Stones, you better look up to Led Zeppelin. And we're like, why? What if I don't like Led Zeppelin? I understand they're musicians. I understand any music, I understand they did something new and groundbreaking in their time, but what if I just not that into it? What if I like today's music better? And now here's a group shouting, "I hate Jimmy Page, get those bleeps off the stage." So So yeah, that's kind of like my driving at night, you know, driving fast music. But is that so? Is that nihilistic? That rejection of Led Zeppelin? That saying I hate Jimmy Page? That's what Jimmy Page was in, right? Led Zeppelin. Someone can correct me if it was, I don't know, another group, but I think it was Led Zeppelin. But I mean, so is that nihilistic when the young are like restlessly kind of like just overturning the previous generation? Or could you make the case that like rock and roll was always kind of like about, I don't know, being a little disruptive and just kind of saying something that hasn't been said before just because you can and because you want to, and it's almost like being nihilistic towards the nihilists in a certain respect. Yeah, so it's like, you know, the rock and roll shocked the old when it first came about, and then the next generation of rock and roll shocked those parents, you know, like you had Ozzy Osbourne, I am Iron Man. I'm sure that definitely freaked out a lot of parents at that time. With each passing generation, you see one group of rockers shocking their parents, shocking the previous generation. And here was Mindless, Self-Indulgence giving the finger to Led Zeppelin, like, oh my God, I can't believe it. Like people thought history is over, right? Like nothing could ever be more rebellious and edgy than Led Zeppelin. But no, turns out these guys were not having it. So in conclusion today, before I get to super chats, I do think that when it comes to this, I do think these anti-racists, they hold racist premises themselves. They do think racism is practical. They think racism is beneficial, let's say to whites, or it's beneficial to somebody, when in reality, racism does not benefit anybody. So having an apartheid does not actually benefit anyone. Having slavery based on race or slavery at all does not benefit anyone. Dictatorship does not benefit anyone. Oppression, the violation of rights benefits no one. So when you look at the difference between the West versus Chad in Africa, it is perfectly proper to say the fossil fuels, capitalism, the protection of individual rights, reason, individualism have done great things for these Western countries, and they're exactly what Chad needs. There's nothing racist about that, and people who hold racist premises, they think racism actually benefits certain groups of people, or they benefit some people. They actually think that beyond that, they think reality is inherently racist, like the requirements of reality to them results in racism. Those people are going to take that statement offensively, that comparison of the West to Chad. They take that as offensive. So yeah, it's sad. What's sad to me is that we live in a world now where when you say the West is better than non-Western countries, people assume you're coming from a racist place. And one of the contributing factors to that is that a lot of the reactionaries, a lot of the so-called alt-right, or even more of the even centrist sort of wannabe scientists who they try to use evolution, I think, inappropriately to explain human behavior. A lot of them do actually hold that genetics are the reason. They actually think that we're just by design, some races are superior to others. So when those people are championing Western civilization, then Western civilization has a problem, right? That's bad publicity for Western civilization. So our work as students of Ayn Rand, our work is really cut out for us. So in conclusion, that there's that point. There is the whole borrowed time concept. Really, all of us are cancelable. All of us have done something that is a cancelable offense in the view of the woke, because again, to the woke, reality itself is racist. Doing something that benefits you in any way, acting in order to further your own life, to them is inherently playing into contributing to the white supremacist system. And they are living on borrowed time. The people pointing the finger at you, they're living on borrowed time because they live with this premise. They live with this ghost that reality is racist. And at some point, they are going to need to address that giant gaping contradiction, that dichotomy they live with, which is the moral versus the practical. And the other point I wanted to raise is just that I've been thinking about this whole phenomenon of the young sort of rejecting what their parents were into, which is a thing we see often. And I'm curious how much of that is rational? How much of that is sort of part of growing up? Is it entirely, the influence of philosophy? Is it that in the modern world, a lot of what the older generations are into are not very good? So let's say if you grew up with parents that are, and the older generation in general is really into Renaissance art, maybe then you wouldn't see the young rolling their eyes and rejecting what the older generation are into. So maybe it's because, let's say, rock and roll, which I love, by the way, rock and roll in some form or another is, and many other pop culture things are something I cannot live without. I can't live without. So I don't mean this to disparage rock and roll or the modern pop culture, but maybe it's not universally great. Like maybe you had to be there. Maybe you had to be 12 or 13 years old when you discovered modern pop culture to really love it. Whereas something like Renaissance art and classical music is more universal. So those are some of the things I've been thinking about. I hope that made some sense. Marilyn, thank you for the super chat. Marilyn, again, thank you for the super chat. She sent $4 twice. Keep hitting that button, Marilyn. I'm kidding. Like the money's not coming through. You got to keep pressing send, but that's a joke. Roll in with 4.99 euro says, if there's a law against super chatting, here I go breaking it. Yeah, I mean, look, money is probably on the list of white supremacist concepts in the eyes of the woke. But, the woke wins by default. The left wins by default. I think Ayn Rand makes that observation in her book, Return of the Primitive, in one or two of the essays, at least. She, I think, makes that observation. It's the altruist premise. It's ultimately the rejection of objective reality. It's the rejection of reason as an absolute. That is, rejecting that reason is an absolute. Rejecting that opens the floodgate, and ultimately the irrational ends up winning as a result of that compromise. Thank you, Marilyn, for the $10. She says, number one fan. All right, everybody. Thank you for joining us today. I think that's all I had to say. And those are all the super chats. So if you'd like, join me on Clubhouse now. We'll be over there. And I think, everybody should buy Alex Epstein's new book, because that's how you fight the left, or that's how you fight the Washington Post. That's how you fight back. One of the ways, other than speaking out, is with dollars and cents. So, and let's face it, I'm sure it's a great book. All right. Thank you all. And coming up today at 10 p.m. UK time, it's The Cutting Edge with Lee Pearson and special guest Shoshana Milgram. They'll be slicing through the movies. Very nice. All right, everybody. See you back here tomorrow on today's Wednesday, right? So see you back tomorrow on the Thursday Collective edition of the Daily Objective. Thank you and goodbye.